This is our second lecture on the book of Numbers. And in this lecture, we will show why Moses and Aaron failed to enter the promised land, but how nonetheless God in his grace ultimately allowed Israel to begin movement towards the land once again, despite opposition from people like Balaam and Balak. And after 40 years be on the brink of entering the land. And then we'll conclude with some theological themes in the book of Numbers. There were 40 years of wilderness wanderings, and Israel was condemned to wander in the wilderness for 40 years because of their failure of faith at Kadesh Barnea, as described in Numbers chapters 13 and 14. Not only Israel as a whole, but Moses and Aaron in particular also failed to enter the land of promise. And you read about that in Numbers chapter 20. In the first month, the whole Israelite community arrived at the desert of Zin, and they stayed at Kadesh, and there Miriam died and was buried. Now there was no water for the community, and the people gathered in opposition to Moses and Aaron. They quarreled with Moses and said, "If only we had died when our brothers fell dead before the Lord," which, by the way, is Korah's rebellion in chapter 16. "Why did you bring the Lord's community into the desert that we and our livestock should die here? Why did you bring us up out of Egypt to this terrible place? It has no grain or figs or grapevines or pomegranates, and there is no water to drink." Moses and Aaron went from the assembly to the entrance of the tent of the meeting and fell face down, and the glory of the Lord appeared to them. The Lord said to Moses, "Take the staff, and you and your brother Aaron gather the assembly together. Speak to that rock before their eyes, and it will pour out its water. You will bring water out of the rock for the community so that they and their livestock can drink." And so Moses took the staff from the Lord's presence, just as he commanded him. And he and Aaron gathered the assembly together in front of the rock. And Moses said to them, "Listen, you rebels, must we bring you water out of this rock?" Then Moses raised his arm and struck the rock twice with his staff. Water gushed out, and the community and their livestock drank. Now, in this story, lack of water leads to complaints. And they wish that they had died with Korah, verse 3, or that they had stayed in Egypt, verse 5. But God told Moses to produce water from a rock, verses 6 through 8, similar to a story in Exodus 17, 5 and 6. And Moses rebuked the people and struck the rock twice, and water rushed out. And you would think that that was the end of the story and they all lived happily ever after. However, that is not the case. God is going to rebuke Moses and pronounce that Moses and Aaron would likewise not enter the land of promise. It says, "Because you did not trust in me enough to honor me as holy in the sight of the Israelites, you will not bring this community into the land that I am giving them." These are the waters of Meribah, where the Israelites quarreled with the Lord and where he showed himself holy among them. Why was it that Moses and Aaron's actions were condemned? Because you did not trust in me. Moses and Aaron showed lack of trust. They showed unbelief. Now, where do you see that in the story? Well, at least one thing that might be an indication of that is that Moses struck the rock not once but twice. Was this an expression of doubt? Doubting even for a moment that God would come through with his promise? But he also says, "You did not honor me as holy in the sight of the Israelites." Moses and Aaron, in this case, glorified themselves rather than God. They said, "Must we bring you water out of this rock?" Well, they had no power to bring water out of the rock. Only God could do that. Psalm 106, verse 32 and 33 comments that Moses had provoked the people because he had spoken harshly with his lips. And these were rash words, glorifying themselves rather than God. And then it also says, later on in verse 20, "Aaron will not enter the land I gave the Israelites because both of you," Moses and Aaron, "rebelled against my command at the waters of Meribah." Now, how is it that Moses and Aaron rebelled against God's command? Well, they were told to assemble the congregation and address the rock. But instead of doing that, Moses addressed the people and struck the rock. They didn't do what they were told to do, and their bad example would encourage the people to be lax in obedience to the commandments of their holy God. Why were Moses and Aaron condemned at Meribah? Because of unbelief, because they glorified themselves rather than God, and because they disobeyed God's command. And the first verse that we read, Miriam also did not enter the land of promise. So the leaders of Israel at the time, Moses and Aaron and Miriam, all failed to enter the land, just as the rest of that first generation, except for Caleb and Joshua. Now, this is a warning even for us. Even leaders of God's people can disqualify themselves by unbelief and glorifying themselves rather than God and disobeying God's command. So we should take warning, we who are leaders in the church. Well, then we have the new generation finally moving forward towards the promised land. In Numbers chapter 21, after 40 years, they begin that movement again. And they first try to go through the land of Edom, chapter 21 and verse 4. Edom were the descendants of Esau, Israel's brother nation, as it were. However, Edom refused to let Israel pass through, as recounted also in Deuteronomy 2, 1 through 7. And so Israel, rather than engaging Edom in war, chose to go around Edom. As here the map shows how they went around the territory of Edom to reach the plains of Moab. And they confront enemies unintentionally. Sihon, the king of the Amorites, and Og, the king of Bashan, both attacked Israel. Israel counterattacked and defeated these kingdoms, and thus these areas of the Transjordan became a part of the land of Israel, even though it's not technically a part of the Promised Land, which was just from the River Jordan to the Mediterranean Sea. And then this brings us to Numbers chapters 22 through 25 and related chapter 31, the story of Balaam and Balak. Balaam was a Mesopotamian diviner, the text says. He was hired by Balak, the king of Moab, for the specific purpose of cursing Israel, putting a hex on Israel. Now, on his way, according to the story, the angel of the Lord intervened, and the angel of the Lord is God. He intervened to block Balaam's way. And Balaam beat his donkey, who was trying to save him from the wrath of the angel of the Lord. And then the donkey is allowed to talk. 3 times Balaam tries to curse Israel, but 3 times Balaam ends up blessing Israel instead in these chapters. Balaam, in his prophecy, has a prophecy with messianic overtones. A star shall come forth from Jacob, and a scepter shall arise from Israel, and shall crush through the forehead of Moab. Now, this could be taken as a prophecy of Messiah, and Jews, such as the Jews that preserved the Dead Sea Scrolls, understood it as a messianic prophecy. It does certainly have messianic implications. There may also be a first application to King David, who conquered Moab. And so, in my view, it's probably an indirectly messianic prophecy, referring to King David, who would conquer Moab, but foreshadowing the work of the scepter and the star, which is Christ. Now the question arises, was Balaam a good guy or was Balaam a bad guy? And the answer is going to be Balaam was a bad guy. Balaam was a Mesopotamian diviner. Divination is condemned in the law in Deuteronomy chapter 18. The fact that he's a diviner would not speak well of him. He was also a pagan. We actually have an extra biblical text found at Tel Deir Allah, which is a site in the East Jordan Valley in modern-day Jordan. Balaam was honored by the pagans there. They were not worshipers of the one God, but by the pagans. Long after Balaam's death, in the 8th century BC, plaster on the wall which talks about Balaam, and these pieces have been reconstructed by archaeologists, and the basic story has been understood, and they celebrated Balaam as one of their own, as a great seer. And so he was celebrated by pagans as being like them rather than like an Israelite prophet. Now God did speak to him, that's true. But bear in mind, in the story, God also speaks through Balaam's donkey. Now, Balaam tried to curse Israel 3 times. It wasn't that wasn't his intention, but God would not let him. He intervened and prevented him from pronouncing the curse on Israel. But that doesn't speak of Balaam well that he tried to curse Israel. And ultimately, the Israelites executed him in Numbers chapter 31 and verse 8, and also 15 and 16, which raises another question. Why was Balaam executed? This is what it says in chapter 31, verse 15. Why have you allowed the women to live, he asked them. They were the ones who followed Balaam's advice and were the means of turning the Israelites away from the Lord in what happened at Peor, so that a plague struck the Lord's people. Now, what's this, what happened at Peor about? Well, Peor refers to the events of Numbers chapter 25. So the execution of Balaam relates to the events of Numbers chapter 25 and certain women who followed Balaam's advice in order to turn the Israelites away from the Lord. Well, what happened in Numbers chapter 25 is that the Israelites were seduced by Midianite and Moabite women, seduced to commit sexual immorality with them and to go to their pagan sacrifices and commit idolatry. A certain Phinehas, the son of Eleazar the priest, put a stop to the immorality, killing an Israelite man and his Moabite lover, and quelled God's wrath. Phineas was awarded with an eternal priesthood because of that action. It turns out that the immorality at Peor was not just an accidental thing. It was planned by Balaam to get God to curse Israel. 3 times he had tried to curse Israel. God intervened and put a blessing in his mouth instead. But then he told the Moabites, Balak, that, I can't curse Israel unless God curses Israel. But let me tell you what you can do to get God to curse Israel. Have the women come and seduce the men to sexual immorality and idolatry, and then God will curse Israel. That was the plan. Revelation chapter 2 and verse 14 makes Balaam's name synonymous with immorality and idolatry, all going back to these events of Numbers chapter 25, the event at Peor. So Balaam was ultimately a bad guy. Let's talk about some theological themes in the book of Numbers. First theme is the failure to live up to one's calling. God's people can fall into a spirit of rebellion, complaining, and ingratitude and lose God's blessing. That can happen to us as well. Paul in 1 Corinthians 10, verses 6 through 12, applies some of these things from Numbers to us. Now, these things happen as examples for us, that we should not crave evil things as they also craved. The events of Numbers 11 and verse 4 and verse 34. Nor let us act immorally as some of them did, and 23,000 fell in one day. The events of Peor in Numbers 25, 1 through 9. Nor let us try the Lord as some of them did and were destroyed by serpents. Numbers 21, verses 4 through 9. Nor grumble as some of them did, and that happens in various places in Numbers, and were destroyed by the destroyer. These things happen as an example, and they were written for our instruction. They were written so that we don't fall into a spirit of rebellion, complaining, ingratitude, and sin the way that they did. Second theme in Numbers is the theme of the promise. The promise in Genesis 12, 1 through 3 is defined as land and seed and blessing. And the seed promise is fulfilled because they count 600,000 men among the Israelites. God was fulfilling the seed promise by having allowed them to multiply greatly. And then the land promise, though one generation failed, numbers in with Israel on the brink of entering the land that God promised to Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. And then the blessing promise is in part, blessed are those that bless you, and cursed are those who curse you. Balaam's oracle actually repeats this promise. Those who bless you will be blessed, and those who curse you will be cursed. And Moab, by trying to curse Israel, was doomed to being conquered by the Davidic king, the scepter and star of Numbers 24 and verse 17. And Balaam, who tried to curse Israel, discovered the truth of his own oracle by being cursed and executed himself. The promise of seed and land and blessing are all furthered in the book of Numbers. You also have teaching about the nature of God, his presence. He was in the midst of the camp, in the narratives. He was accessible to them by prayer. His holiness. God's holiness is seen in his acts of judgment on Israel, including Miriam and Aaron and Moses, all showing God's intolerance of sin. It also indicates that Israel is to be holy, mindful of God's holiness. Israel was to be careful to avoid both moral and ceremonial uncleanness. We also see something of God's covenant love, his chesed. Moses in Numbers 14 asked God to act in accordance with his chesed, his covenant love. Chesed is hard to translate, but it means some combination of love, grace, faithfulness, loyalty to relationships. And God showed all of these things to Israel. We also see God as a guider of his people. He would guide them by a pillar of cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night, leading his people in the desert. And God continues to be a guider of his people today. We also see him as a provider for his people. God provided manna and quail and water and victories over enemies. There are also lessons about worship in this book. It shows us that worship is active. They give gifts to God. They listen to him speak. They purify themselves before meeting with him. All this is found in Numbers chapter 7 and 8. Their worship includes holy days and festivals as delineated in Numbers 28 and 29. Worship includes special dedications to God like Nazirite and other vows, Numbers 6 and chapter 30. We also see how intercession and propitiation play a role. The intercession by Moses saved Israel numerous times. Moses' prayer saved his people in Numbers 14. As it says in Psalm 106, verse 23, he, referring to God, would have destroyed them had Moses, his chosen one, not confronted him in the breach to avert his destructive wrath. And Moses interceded several other times in Numbers. He interceded when fire came from God on the people for their complaining in Numbers 11. He intervened concerning Miriam's leprosy in chapter 12. He intervened concerning God's wrath in chapter 16. He intervened concerning the poisonous snake bites in chapter 21. This says something about the power of prayer, that interceding in prayer can do great things. God also was placated by Aaron's priestly work, his intercession, as it were. Aaron stemmed a plague by offering incense in Numbers 16. And the atoning and propitiatory sacrifices that Aaron and his sons would conduct would allow forgiveness of sin, as described in Numbers 15, verses 22 through 28. And this reminds us as Christians of a verse in 1 John 1:7, how the blood of Jesus, his Son, cleanses us from all sin. We can also learn lessons about leadership from this book. There are true leaders and false leaders. True leaders are chosen by God. False leaders choose themselves. And Korah is an example of one of those false leaders that chose himself rather than being chosen by God. There's also the inheritance of leaders. God's leaders have God as their essential inheritance. That's why the Levites should be supported because they had no inheritance other than God himself. If we become leaders of God's people, we might be asked to make financial sacrifices, but we always have God as our inheritance. We also see jealousy among God's leaders. Sadly, there can be such things. Aaron and Miriam were jealous of their brother Moses and his leadership role, and Korah was jealous of the role of the Levites. And sadly, that can happen among leaders of God's people, even in the church today. And we see some of the delineation of the duties of leaders. They can delegate responsibilities, as you see in Numbers chapters 1 and 11. They can guard that which is sacred and holy. Numbers 3 through 5, they're dedicated to God to bless others. In Numbers chapter 6, they assist God's people in worship, Numbers 7 and 8. They guide God's people into action and spiritual warfare, Numbers chapter 10. But unfortunately, leaders can also fail to live up to God's calling, as was the case of Miriam and Moses and Aaron in Numbers chapter 20. Various sins are also condemned in this book. Here's a long list of them: sacrilege, jealousy, ingratitude, gluttony, envy, racism. Moses' siblings were racist against his Cushite wife in Numbers 12. There's Sabbath breaking, there's rebellion against God, there's false teaching, there's idolatry and sexual immorality. All of those things are condemned here and there in the book of Numbers. And we, of course, should take heed, since such sins still plague God's people today. But then there's renewal. A new generation comes along. Although the first generation in the wilderness fell short, hope and renewal came through the next generation. Numbers chapters 26 through 36. And it's that next generation that would actually enter into the land promised to them. It's actually that next generation that would enter the land of promise in accordance with the promise of God to the patriarchs. And that renewal was led by new leaders. New leaders come along to replace the old. You get Eleazar, the priest that replaces Aaron. You have Joshua, who would replace Moses. And they bring Israel into the land, something that the older leaders were unable to do. And so in each generation, God raises up new leaders who can do what the previous leaders perhaps were unable to do. And then you have a new promise, the promise of a star and scepter from Israel that would crush Moab, renews Israel's hope that it would enter the land, a promise that anticipates both David and ultimately Jesus Christ. So God continues to renew his church today with new leaders and reminding us of our promises in Christ. And so that completes our lecture on the book of Numbers.